Bam ba bam 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 ba bam bam ba bam 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 ba bam bam bam. What do you think of that, Alex?
Oh dear. All right. I miss you. I'll tell you that much for free. I miss our trip around some of the rarer parts of Mexico, starting with a lovely little town in the middle of nowhere called Teotihuacan, and where I at least had some of the best tacos I've ever had in the smallest little town in the middle of nowhere. It really did feel like an old Wild West ghost town at points. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about actual ghost towns in two senses, I think. On one side, it's the ruins of ancient civilizations, but also they're ghost towns today when they really shouldn't be. We're talking about
the secret gems of Mexican archaeology.
But wait, before we get into that, I just want to make a quick announcement, which is at the Mexico Political Economist, we are embarking on a new journey. It's called the Plan Mexico Project. You can read all about it in the show notes, but very briefly, we're hiring. We're hiring a project lead for that particular project, and we're hoping that perhaps out there is that future hire amongst our readers. So please do have a look in the show notes if you're interested. If you know anyone who might be interested, we're very excited about this. And on with the show.
We're not trying to just be hipster here by looking for hidden gems. It's a little bit hipster too, but I think there's plenty of wonderful archaeological sites in Mexico that are worth visiting. Chichen Itzá, Uxmal, Teotihuacan, Palenque, they're all amazing and beautiful and whatnot. Go to visit them. They're great. But like all places that are incredibly famous, they also come with a lot of more disagreeable elements, right?
Baggage.
Exactly. And it's part of like mega tourism problems all over the world. So going to Rome or going to Paris, beautiful, also has things that aren't great. And if you go to Chichen Itzá, for example, it's always going to be absolutely packed. You're always sort of restraining what you can do because there's too many people and they have to protect the monuments. There's always someone trying to sell you stuff. You go to Teotihuacan and you hear these incessant noises of jaguars. This of people trying to sell you stuff with this little like instrument that makes a jaguar noise, and it gets really annoying.
Of course, there's lots of good reasons why lots of people go to these very packed archaeological sites. In large part, obviously, nowadays because of the algorithm, but the algorithm was fed data. And that data is very much dictated by the prejudices of the Mexican state. And Mexican culture is dictated by the official history. And so you've got to go to Teotihuacan because it's what the Aztecs thought was the city of gods. And the Aztecs are the center of the Mexican national story. And so we've got to go there. They're really impressive. It does look, I would have believed that it was built by gods if I was back in the day. But there are so many other incredible sites that I think are worth visiting that are simply not part of the national history. In some ways, because they don't fit in the national history because of the complexity. And sometimes, in one of the cases we're going to be talking about, they don't fit into the national story because we literally didn't know about these civilizations up until about half a century ago. And their introduction into the historical debate really calls into question a lot of the stories we tell ourselves about Mexico today.
There's a stat that always comes to mind to me when it comes to these ruins that are all over the country. So there were more people in Mesoamerica, which we'll define in a second, in 1519, before the Spanish meet the Aztecs in Tenochtitlan, than there were in 1920. This was a very heavily populated part of the world with very sophisticated civilizations, which of course then meant that there were a ton of major cities and massively interesting, culturally rich cities. Therefore, there are many, many, many ruins.
And you've mentioned a snapshot, right? 1519. But remember, these civilizations, many of them died out centuries before. So not only have you got tons of people at that one very moment across an area we call Mesoamerica, but also we have thousands of years of history spread out across timelines that we call the pre-classic, the classic, and the post-classic, which we will also be defining in a second.
But this all means that if you start digging, quite literally, you are going to find a lot of things that are really interesting, that are really worth visiting. And yes, a lot of that has already been explored and sadly destroyed over the centuries, but a lot of it remains.
It remains uncovered as well. This is one of the wonders that we discovered when we went on a recent trip. We went to the ruins of a place that started to be properly excavated about 30 years ago, and which seems massive to us, or at least seemed massive to us as we stood under the massive temples and the houses and all that, until we were informed that that was about 2% of the entire city, and we'd been walking for hours.
Yeah, it was incredible. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So why don't we get to this defining of these tricky terms, or these slippery terms of Mesoamerica and the classic and post-classic ages. So what is Mesoamerica, Alex?
I mean, these terms are so annoying as a layperson, because obviously archaeologists are a formal study. They take themselves seriously, as they should. But it also means that they're incredibly boring when they try to explain this sort of stuff. And so a lot of the definitions that they come up with often have to do with the research that they've been doing, the archaeological research, which means that they've been digging up old vases, ceramics, and looking at different forms of arches. And they go on and on about the architectural style and all that. And that's how they define when and where these civilizations were, and lose about 99.9% of their audiences on the way. But very briefly, very archaeology for dummies here. Mesoamerica is the space that encompasses, we'll say, the bottom half of Mexico, where you would think of the Aztecs and Teotihuacan to have lived, all the way down past the Mayans and into Central America. This space is considered a sort of civilizational area because it was very influenced by a few very specific historical moments and historical cultures, namely the Olmecs. And the Olmecs were right in the middle of Mesoamerica, and they begin, as you might expect, in the pre-classical age.
The Olmecs were centered around Tabasco, and they're the oldest of all of these. They date back to more than 2,000 years before the Common Era. And in terms of like the borders, you mentioned sort of halfway through Mexico. I think maybe around Michoacán, more or less, roughly. Would that be the northern border?
It's annoyingly, as all borders tend to be, that's very squiggly because it depends on the terrain. It depends on how far north. Basically, Septentrional America, Desert America, going up into the northern states of Mexico and into the United States, obviously did have deep relationships with Mesoamerica. They weren't cut off by some sort of weird wall. And there was a lot of trade and a lot of prejudice. They called them chichimecas, generically, barbarians. This is the Aztec term for it. But the archaeologists and the anthropologists sort of defined this as a cutoff point because this is where the massive civilizations sort of stop. And it's kind of the way that we might think of the Mediterranean world, right? You've got the barbarians in the north, but they're still dealing with the barbarians, and they're all influenced across this great lake that is the Mediterranean Sea, but they're very different cultures across hundreds and thousands of years. And so you can get the Romans and the Greeks, and they influence the English perhaps, or the Egyptians, but they're very much centered around this civilizational area.
And the thing about them is that they were linked by a sort of shared set of beliefs that stem, as you mentioned, from the Olmecs, but all the civilizations that follow the Mayans, the Toltecs, the Zapotecs, the Mixtecs, the Teotihuacans, the Aztecs, and so on, they all have a set of sort of religious beliefs and societal beliefs that are based on something very similar to what the Olmecs first developed. So it's like having a sort of shared, like sort of the Christian world, let's say, in Europe. There might be different, flavors of it, but there's a lot of commonalities across the different, at least Western European states. Some idea in Mesoamerica. And when you start going further north, things start to change.
Yes. And in a similar way to the way maybe the Greeks had Zeus and then the Romans had Jupiter, and it's the same, more or less the same god with different facets. You've got very similar, the appearance of very similar gods and deities and beliefs across this Mesoamerican area, from Kukulkan, the plumed serpent god in the Mayan area, to Quetzalcoatl, which people recognize more in the Nahua world of the Aztecs, who is more or less the same god, thousands of years later in a different language, in a different historical context.
And maybe that's a good segue into these very boring terms of classic and pre-classic and so on. You can basically divide the entire Mesoamerican history from thousands of years before the Common Era to usually the demise of the Aztec civilization, even though some civilizations continue to endure after that. And what we have is usually 3 or 4 periods. You have the pre-classic, which is fundamentally everything before Teotihuacan.
Yes.
The classic, which is Teotihuacan basically controlling in some way or another most of Mesoamerica. And then here, it depends who you ask. Usually, like, everyone agrees that there's a post-classic that comes after Teotihuacan. And then usually there's an epi-classic, because there's a period. And this is something that will link all of the sites that we're about to discuss. There's a period between the fall of Teotihuacan and the rise of another civilization that comes hundreds of years later called the Toltecs. And this period is defined by the appearance of a series of states that fill the vacuum left by the fall of Teotihuacan.
Exactly right. And it's interesting also because Teotihuacan and the Olmecs and all these unique but very specific civilizations, specific to their time and place, have an inordinate amount of influence on how we define these pre-classic, post-classic, and classic eras, right? Let's get the actual numbers out, because they're very precise.
650, 650 to 900, and then all the way to about 1,000, to 1,100.
Mm-hmm. And then 1100 to 1521, precisely, is the end of post-classic. But this is because it's very much based on the study of the great civilizations that the early archaeologists discovered and that fit into this narrative. Obviously, it's far more complex, but annoyingly, you've got to pick a number, and that's why they're nice round numbers, which then end up being completely useless when you get into the complexities and subtleties of these massive transgenerational civilizations. And that leads us nicely into our first underrated ruin in Mexico, because this is a not-so-classic Mayan classical city-state. Classical why? Because it was inhabited more or less between the year 400 and the year 1000, even though for hundreds of years later, goat herders and people would hang out around the ruins. But the great moment of that civilization, its rise and peak, was between those years, 400 and 1000 AD.
And I think what's interesting there is the Mayans are pretty unique because most civilizations, or practically all civilizations of Mesoamerica, rise and fall, and then that's it. They have a 200-year span or 400-year span. What's interesting about the Mayans is that they are pretty much there the whole time. Just with different sort of... They still are, exactly. The Mayan people are still alive. The Mayan language still alive and well. So the Mayan people, with their culture and their religion, continue to inhabit the south of Mexico and much of Central America, while this city had already fallen hundreds and hundreds of years before.
And this city is Itzá. Itzá is a bog standard city-state in many ways. It was powerful in its region, but it was competing amongst other city-states in the Yucatan Peninsula. And that's what's interesting about this particular city-state, because it's in the wrong place, at least by the sort of generic patterns that we're supposed to see by these historical definitions, right? Over the course of history, what archaeologists tended to see, power moved from the lowlands to the highlands as time went on. The power dynamic moved from Guatemala into the north, into the Yucatan, the Mexican part of the Mayan civilizational area, still in Mesoamerican, but the Mayan era. And what's fascinating is that is very much a classical civilization, but in the north of the Mayan region. It's currently in the state of Campeche, and it's a great civilization by any sense of the term. It is full of people, tens of thousands of people at its peak, and it's got incredible infrastructure and trade relations. The most particularly interesting one is the water infrastructure, which all Mayans had to have at the time because of the porous nature of the soil there. And this water infrastructure allowed this civilization to have water all year round, because, as you know, Mexico will often have a very, very wet, rainy season, followed by months of dry. And what this civilization in Itzá did was create enormous water infrastructure to keep water flowing through the city throughout the dry months. And that allowed them to grow big and powerful throughout the hundreds of years that they lived through. And, of course, as happened to other Mayan civilizations, but particularly to this one, as climate changed, as sometimes naturally and often because of deforestation in this area. It's lush jungle, but it's not particularly fertile soil. And so if you cut down all the trees and did agriculture, you'd soon find yourself having to cut down more trees because that plot of land will have lost its fertility. And so you do that for a few hundred years, and what you end up getting is a massive drought, which seems to have torn these civilizations apart. And this happened to different city-states at different times of their history, and which is why these very nice round numbers of the pre-classical and post-classical eras are difficult to mesh up with reality. Because people tend to think, oh, well, something must have happened between the classical and the post-classical era. And the answer is maybe not. Maybe it was actually just a gradual hundreds of years long transition from the Guatemalan lowlands into Yucatan, but not something that you could say this is when history happened.
Now, I fully agree with that. And yes, this climatic change, which actually isn't just lived in the Mayan region, it's lived all across Mesoamerica and parts of northern Mexico as well. They talk of a 500-year-long drought. So while all this is definitely true, there are some clear-cut political events that happen. And we'll actually get to possibly the most interesting of them all, that opens the door to completely reimagining the history of these regions when we get to Cantone. But carry on.
So what we definitely do know is what happened once our civilization, the post-modern Mexican civilization, arrived at Itzá in the 1970s, when they started really working that archaeological area. I think it's wonderful to see how not only does history repeat itself, but also what you get is a series of patterns happening. The first being the arrival of the Guatemalans in the 1980s. This was part of a program between the Mexican state and Guatemalan refugees who were escaping the civil war. Most of these people, Mayan peoples from Guatemala, rushing into Mexico to avoid what was basically ethnic cleansing by part of the Guatemalan authorities. And they were hired to become the first big systematized archaeological diggers across the site of Itzá. Fast forward many years, and what you get is a lovely, beautiful site, well kept, but not particularly well visited. And I think I wasn't the only person to realize that when I went. Incredible ruins, incredible jungle surrounding it, but sort of lonely. And someone else who noticed this clearly was López Obrador, who is part of a school of thinking in Mexico called indigenism. His great mentor, Carlos Pellicer, was the great indigenist of the 20th century. Now, a lot of people have really turned against this way of seeing things. Indigenism is a sort of romantic way of seeing indigenous people and the indigenous path, sort of the noble savage sort of approach to archaeology and anthropology. And people really reject this approach, but it's really molded how López Obrador saw his relationship to these ruins. And so during his presidency, between 2018 to 2024, he embarked on a titanic project, akin only to the great temple of Chichen Itzá in the region, which was the Maya train. And the Maya train was supposed to be a commuter train, or is a commuter train, that goes around the Mayan Peninsula, stopping off at the great cities of the peninsula, but also at some of its most historical sites, including Itzá. And so what you've got now is a train stop with a new hotel built by the Mexican army. Not only did they build the rail station and the rail line, they also built the hotel that tourists are supposed to stay at. And when I talked to the guides there, they were actually kind of excited because this is their living, right? They live from the tourism. They were happy about the extra people coming in for the extra money, but they were also very keenly aware about what you said, Tavo, which is they were worried about the arrival of masses of people because these guides are still the Mayan folk who live in the area. And they're very protective about what they see as their own personal ancestral legacy.
Yeah, it's super interesting because, I mean, I visited Itzá about 10 years ago, actually almost 10 years to the day, because I was living in the state of Campeche at the time. Not a recommendable place to live, but a beautiful place to visit. And the city of Itzá the ruins of Itzá stand out in my mind for two reasons. One, being extraordinary, very, very impressive. And two, being very empty.
Yes.
There was one more car there. We never actually saw the people who came in that car. I don't know if they were actually in the ruins. And also, it wasn't developed at all. There was no museum. There was like the way in where you paid was made of wood. It was basically a shack made of wood, and it had a thatched roof. And it was extraordinary to me that such a magnificent site would have such little infrastructure and be so thoroughly surrounded by jungle. Because if you go to Chichen Itzá, it's much more developed all around. There's parking lots, whereas this was sort of like Indiana Jones.
When I went about a couple of years ago, they were just building that infrastructure. So I didn't get to use it, but you could see it was coming. And this Mayan guide, who was really knowledgeable, told us about all this history that had gone on there, was also very conscious about the more recent history of the site and the recent effects that the Mexican state can have in the destruction of these sites, as well as the salvaging of them. Most notably, the 1970s saw the arrival of a new group of people, and it was the Mennonites. These are sort of European religious communities that don't mix with anyone else, very similar to the Amish. And they are Protestant, they're sort of Germanic, and they are incredibly industrious. They don't drink, they don't dance, they don't do anything but work. And the Mexican government loved this because it said, this is the sort of industriousness we need. And they're almost always farm. And they've got their own way of doing things, imported from Europe. And usually they're in the north of Mexico. But the government made a deal with these folks more or less at the time that the Itzá ruins were being excavated. And they were brought down to Yucatan to develop it, quote unquote, and to farm it. The thing is, the way of farming of the Mennonites is completely different from the way that you should probably do the farming in this very porous land, very unfertile jungle land. I mean, they're from Central Europe. And what they do is they'll destroy a lot of the forest and dig up a lot of the ruins because they have no context for this. They've been brought in by the Mexican state to basically dig it up and make it economically prosperous.
And the crazy thing is, you're not supposed to do agriculture in this part of the world, at least not modern agriculture, because as you mentioned, Alex, the land is very infertile. And what does that mean? I mean, it's a jungle, how can it be infertile? The problem, the thing is that you have a very thin topsoil, a very fertile soil. It's fantastic. Anything will grow there, and therefore we have a jungle. But it's very, very thin. Immediately below it, you get profoundly unfertile, very difficult to sort of, for roots to go through limestone. So people who are used to doing agriculture in the very fertile valley floors of, say, Germany, will arrive here and immediately destroy the environment there and also be very unproductive because the land is just not prepared for it.
But the Mennonites aren't the only problem here. The López Obrador government was also a big issue for the archaeological community as well, because in his zeal to build this massive Maya train, he got the army to build it because they were effective and quick at doing it. And in the process, what they did was devastate a lot of the natural and archaeological wonders. Usually what you get when you build a road or a new bit of land is that it takes years and everyone hates the red tape, but actually turns out it's pretty useful because you don't put a massive pylon through a historic ancestral lake, underground lake called a cenote, and you don't ravage a whole quarter of a city that was up until then previously undiscovered. And so what you'd get is archaeologists and environmentalists and biologists at the forefront of these projects before they came in with the bulldozers. There was no such thing in the rush to get the Maya train done. And so they destroyed a whole lot of what was probably invaluable archaeological treasures as they built the train that was supposed to bring people to see the wonders of Itzá.
One of the problems here is, and this happens all over the country, it's not just López Obrador and the army, it's happened since the beginning of time, at least since the beginning of the modern era of Mexico in the 20th century, where it's a very hierarchical country. Decisions are often made in faraway Mexico City, and the guy at the top makes a decision, and then things happen, and they just happen very quickly, and often in a very destructive and often in a very corrupt way. And that has led to, that also happens very often because there's another extreme of the way things work in Mexico. And a wonderful example of that happens to be the INAH. This is the National Institute for Anthropology and History. The guy is responsible for protecting protecting, excavating, publicizing, and so on, the great monuments of Mexico. So if I'm saying that on one extreme you have, hierarchical, big decisions, destruction, what's the problem with the INAH? It has many positive things, no doubt about it. But one very clear problem is that, A, they're very slow and bureaucratic, but also they're overwhelmingly made up of very cultured, educated, well-meaning individuals who have a very romanticized idea of sort of the role of national patrimony, particularly cultural patrimony. So there's always a problem there's always an enormous amount of tension surrounding the monuments of Mexico, because the INAH, charged with protecting them, is sort of at war with the idea they could be used for anything other than cultural patrimony and protection. So when anyone tries to come up with a public-private partnership, for example, that will both benefit the monuments and generate profit, they're at war with that. They come out and they protest and they say this is prostituting the patrimony and the history of the country, and that's just unacceptable. So many of the monuments all over the country require a lot of work because the INAH is also heavily underfunded. They need the support. They need new ideas to bring money in and to attract more people in a constructive way. But they just refuse to play ball with anything that will touch or even moderately, potentially put the monuments at risk.
Which they're right to do, right? This is one of the interesting debates. I think I'd be on the side of the INAH if it weren't so chronically and desperately underfunded, because you've got one of two options, right? On one side, you've got the INAH defending the state's right, I think rightly, to be the defender, the custodian of Mexico's national patrimony. I don't want a McDonald's at one of the temples in Itzá. However, the issue here is inaction. What we've got is decades of underfunding, which means that what happens is they'll make a discovery and they'll find this wonderful civilization, and then they won't have the means to excavate or protect it, which means a lot of Indiana Jones is coming in, which I know a lot of people think of Indiana Jones as a hero. He's actually a damn criminal. He's always going in and stealing stuff.
He's a looter.
From tombs. He's a looter. And you've got a massive issue with looters in Mexico. And a lot of it does have to do with the underfunding of the INAH. And so you lose a lot of the patrimony through this underfunding as well.
That's definitely true. I mean, there is a core problem of one of Mexico's biggest and most sustainable sources of economic growth is tourism. Cultural patrimony is a massive part of that tourism. And also beyond the money, it's just something incredibly valuable and beautiful that should be taken care of. And yet, even though we all agree on that, no one actually ever wants to pay for it. So yes, the INAH is consistently between a rock and a hard place. But that said, they could take on a slightly different approach. Like there's a saying in Spanish, ni cachan, ni pichan, ni dejan batear, which essentially means they're not willing to let people do anything, but they're also not willing to come up with constructive ways of getting funding, but they also have no funding. So there needs to be a mindset change in the INAH if we're going to move forward constructively. But that said, despite their shortcomings, they are very good at what they do when you let them do it properly. A lot of the sites suffer also from politicization because, they're sort of a symbol of Mexicanity, Mexicanness, what would you say? Like Teotihuacan, like El Templo Mayor in Mexico City, like Chichen Itzá. So everyone who has some sort of, position of power in the Ministry of Culture has an opinion about what should be done with these monuments, and then it's very difficult to actually move anything. Big problem. But then you get little gems like Itzá and our next site, Xochicalco, where they just let the professionals do their job. They give them the money that they need and they let them work without the politics getting in the way. And when they let them do that, they do very often a wonderful, wonderful job. So Xochicalco is a city that is in the state of Morelos. It's about 2 hours from Mexico City, but only about 40 minutes away from Cuernavaca. the capital of Morelos. This is to the southwest of Mexico City, about an hour and a half away from Tasco, another beautiful colonial town worth visiting. Xochicalco is really interesting because I ended up going to Xochicalco about 9 years ago for the first time, having never heard of it, because an Italian co-worker recommended it. And this guy was an amateur archaeologist, very Indiana Jones without being a looter, a very serious archaeologist. And he said, he said to us, I can't believe that you Mexicans never go to all the places worth seeing. Like, you're all obsessed with like 2 places and you know nothing about them. And then there's all these amazing places worth visiting that you've never heard of. And he said Xochicalco is a foremost example of that. You should visit Xochicalco. So we went to Xochicalco. And boy, was he right. We got there, and the museum was extraordinary. It was not this typical sort of boring museum that you often get where they're just repeating the people here used to eat corn and tomatoes and, the occasional turkey. No. This was incredibly insightful, interesting, but also well curated and just easy to navigate museum. It was fun. It was so well made. And in very little time, you learned a ton about Mesoamerican history in general, but specifically about the peoples of Xochicalco. And the ruins, more importantly, are equally fascinating. This is a much smaller city than Teotihuacan, for example. It's smaller also than, at least the part that has been uncovered is smaller than Itzá. But what has been uncovered is fantastic. There's so much detail. I don't know exactly how it ended up being so protected from the elements that when they uncovered everything, you have these perfectly detailed sort of designs all over the walls with a level of detail that you don't really see in many other places in Mesoamerica and from this age and anywhere in the world, really. And what's interesting about Xochicalco is that, contrary to Itzá, their heyday isn't in the classical era, but rather in the epiclassical era. Xochicalco is one of the states that appears to fill the vacuum left by Teotihuacan, who was falling in the period after 650 of the Common Era. Contrary to Teotihuacan, even though they did do trade, they were more of a military society. The Teotihuacan people were peoples more focused on trade and craft, whereas the people of Xochicalco were a lot more belligerent, let's say. And what was particularly special to me about the Xochicalcan ruins was because the part that has been uncovered is relatively small, but with so much detail in every one of the ruins that you can actually see. In a relatively small space, we ended up spending several hours in it. And I felt like I really got to see like every sort of little detail that was there and every little nook of the place, which is really special because if you go to Teotihuacan, you could spend a month there and there would always be something more to see because every building alone is colossal.
Every corner of a building in Teotihuacan is someone's doctorate. And it's very
Exactly.
much the inheritance of the Mexican state that is the inheritor of the Aztec state, which felt it was the inheritor of the city of gods, which is Teotihuacan.
Exactly. And a place like Xochicalco, despite it having been very important at controlling a very large part of modern-day Mexico at some point and for several hundred years, it doesn't have that sort of symbolic weight upon it. And that allows you also to see it in a different light. It also allows the archaeologists to work more freely, etc. The thing about Xochicalco is, after a meteoric rise in the Epiclassic, around the year 900, there's a very clear point in which they suddenly collapse. There seems to be some sort of battle inside of Xochicalco. There's fire and destruction, and the civilization of Xochicalco disappears overnight. People continue to live there, of course, because, there's big infrastructure, but the civilization fades. It's unclear exactly who they went to war with. They were a belligerent crew, as I said, so they were fighting everyone at all times, and they were very good at fighting, so they must have angered someone big for them to actually lose. No one knows who it was, but there's several players at the time who were equally belligerent and equally dangerous, and one of those actually lived in a third site. On the opposite sides of the mountains that cross Mexico north to south, slightly further north than Xochicalco, the city of Cantona.
Now, I've never been to an archaeological site that has impressed me more, and that's saying something, because the massive pyramids of Teotihuacan, the incredible sites of Calakmul and Chichen Itzá in the Mayan world are a sight to behold. But they're very much standalone wonders. And what is wonderful about Cantona is that it is a city like no other. In many senses, because it was actually different in the way they built it, but also because of what survives. The reason I found out about this is because twice a year, every year, I go down this road to visit family from Mexico City to the city of Jalapa, closer to the Gulf Coast. And I'd never stopped. And clearly nobody does, because it is an abandoned ruin, even though it is outstanding in its infrastructure. Cantona is a civilization unto itself that was discovered about 30 years ago, properly. The excavations really started 30 years ago, even though we've known about some sort of ruins there for about over a century. And what's incredible about it is that everything has been preserved to a much greater extent than in other civilizations across Mesoamerica. In Mesoamerica, in the Mayan region, you've got the jungle and trees literally tearing buildings apart. Further up north, you've got, sure, the big stone temples, but clearly people lived in other sorts of thatched hay and adobe housing, which was eaten away by time. Whereas Cantona was built atop the massive lava flats of this part of Puebla in central Mexico. And the lava flats, and they built their city out of that lava. And it remains there, more or less untouched. And so, sure, you've got the massive temples, the massive courts where they used to play ball, and the houses of the elite that tend to be made of the sturdier stuff. You can also see the housing inhabited by the soldiery and even the working classes. And it's incredible because you can walk down the streets, which are the inverse of what we're used to. Instead of having buildings looming over the streets, you've got the streets that have become walls unto themselves, looming over individual sort of neighborhoods, family neighborhoods, where people gathered, lived, made food, and cooked. And you can still see more or less exactly how they lived to this day, which is something I'd never seen before. The people's city, rather than just the elites.
And it's really interesting because, as we mentioned before, most civilizations in Mesoamerica are based on sort of the theology of the Olmecs, and that cosmological vision that they had of the world was always translated to their urban planning. But in order to be able to do that, they usually would build on big flat spaces, like, for example, in Teotihuacan, such that you could set the city up according to your plans without, stuff in the way. You didn't have bulldozers and big machines and dynamite, so you had to pick a place where you could, set things up the way you wanted from the get-go. But the thing about Cantona is that it's quite different because it is on this massive lava thing. It's actually, in Spanish, this type of formation is called the mal país. It's literally bad country, because that's how terrible. Badlands, exactly. It's a lot like the volcanic islands that you get in the Atlantic. So places like Tenerife, for example, are also a mal país. And Tenerife is not very inhabited. Why? Because it's not fertile, it's inhospitable. But the people of Cantona were hardy, and they, tunneled their way through it. And this means that the city looks very different to cities in the rest of Mesoamerica. As you mentioned, Alex, you could see the housing of the broader population. Yes, that's one big thing. But also, what was special for me is that it looks a lot more like a medieval city, because everything has to be like really tight. You have these like very narrow little streets between the houses, which is not Mesoamerican at all. But the people of Cantona had to make do with what they had.
It also allowed them to really fortify themselves because they were so tight, in the same way a medieval city used to do. It was almost impermeable from outside attack. And so you get the bit of the history of Cantona. And what's incredible to me is that we didn't really know the civilization existed until relatively recently. And it's almost certain to completely revolutionize the way we understand everything else about Mesoamerican history. Because if in the pre-classic era you had the Olmecs, in the classic era, what you call the epi-classic Tavo, is Teotihuacan, the great hegemon of its time. And yet, almost as a side note, in the museum in Cantona, you get a hint that actually these people on this very key road between the coast and central Mexico, these people who worked with obsidian just as the Teotihuacanos did, which was both a weapon and a tradable asset, it feels like these people were actually one of the main reasons that Teotihuacan evolved in the way it did, and also maybe the reason it collapsed, because, interestingly, Cantona was created in the pre-classical era, has its heights more or less on the border between the classical and the post-classical.
I found that super, super interesting because, once again, the museum at Cantona was fantastic, very well explained. And something that was special was that there were people there, the people who make sure that you don't steal things, basically. They were also very, very knowledgeable and keen to share their knowledge. I'm keen to share their knowledge. And one of the guys there, we were discussing with him a little bit about the timelines, because, they start becoming really, really important right as Teotihuacan is beginning to become less important. And talking to him, he actually said that they couldn't write this in the museum yet because, there's no consensus yet amongst the archaeologists. But it seems that as Teotihuacan was becoming weaker, probably because of climatic events, something really interesting happens in Cantona right about the same time, which is there is a big coup in Cantona, and it goes from being a theocratic society to being a military society. So the people who take over are the generals.
And you must remember that this is done through archaeology. There's no written records as far as we can tell. And it's amazing how archaeologists can tell. And it's relatively simple once you've made the discovery and you've made that logical leap, which us mere mortals can't do, which is you see the sudden change between the pottery and the architecture and the statues that they used to have, very much focused on the gods, clearly theocratic. Those are the ones at the top of every temple. They're the ones at the center of life. And that suddenly changes. And you get this weird iconoclastic moment where they destroy they destroy and deface a lot of these monuments. And then from that moment on, you just see a complete change in the nature of that society.
And as they became this new way, we do have evidence that they were fighting all over the place. We find more weaponry and these kinds of things that also can be dated to this period. And right as they're rising, Teotihuacan continues to fall, and they rise more, and Teotihuacan falls more, and so on. And the thesis that, again, no consensus yet, but the thesis seems to be that because Cantona also traded in the same thing, or mainly in the same thing as Teotihuacan, this obsidian, this volcanic glass, which is very useful and was very valuable, they were able to block off Teotihuacan from a lot of its trade routes and invade anyone who didn't want to be their friends and slowly take over the world that Teotihuacan had once controlled. It may even be the case that they could be behind the fall of Xochicalco, because there is evidence, extensive evidence, that you can actually see in the museum, of them having goods from the trade routes that would have passed through Xochicalco as well.
It's a bit of a Strait of Hormuz in the pre-Hispanic age situation.
Exactly. As amazing as Cantona was, and it is really, really extraordinary, my favorite thing wasn't the museum, and it wasn't just how unique it was.
And it's not even the toilets, which were incredible as well.
That may be my second or third favorite thing. But my favorite thing was the people. As I said, we had this very, very knowledgeable man and very eager to share his knowledge man in the museum. But we met other people while we were walking these incredibly empty and fantastic ruins. So we met this man. His name is Jose Martin. It's likely that Mr. Martin won't be listening to this podcast, but a shout out to him because he was absolutely delightful. And his story which he shared with us, thankfully, was that he had been part of the original excavation team 30 years ago when they first decided to, dig up the city of Cantona. As you said, Alex, we've known about this place roughly since the mid-19th century, but we had a vague idea of it being there. This man, Jose Martin, who comes from a village that's 10 minutes away, told us that he'd grown up there. He was a goat herder in his youth. And the locals didn't really believe that there was anything there. They just thought it was, a bunch of hills covered with cacti and bush. And when the INA arrives 30 years ago and says, we're going to start digging up, people say, well, I'll sign up. You're going to pay me, sure, but I don't know what you're digging up. And he worked on the excavation for decades.
And he's still there to this day. He's not quite a guide because he is just a local goat herder who became a man who looks after the site and takes great pride in his work. He's not a professional archaeologist or tour guide, and so he's not allowed to give tours. There's not enough people probably to have proper tours yet. Hopefully they'll have that someday. But it was wonderful just to see local people taking pride in their local environments. You saw that in Itzá, when you had Mayan local man showing people around what he saw rightly as his ancestral legacy. And you see the people of Cantona working in and around the place, excavating it and looking after it. And I thought it was wonderful. Hopefully, there'll be some sort of budget coming down someday soon, because as we said at the beginning, Cantona has only been really uncovered at about 2% of its capacity. It's still a massive city and a massive civilization to be discovered.
And as you say, there's this 2% that's been discovered so far. It is likely that what we've discovered is the most important part, because the archaeologists are smart and they can, sort of figure out where to start and focus on the big stuff first. So it is unlikely that what they will continue to find will be much, much more impressive than what they've already discovered. But what is clear is that there is a lot more to uncover.
Although I would say that ultimately what this series has taught us is that there is something that goes beyond the impressive. Cantona is wonderful because it's a massive city that you can see in its entirety rather than just the big temples. And maybe the impressive stuff has already been uncovered, but perhaps the important stuff, maybe another clue as to what the civilization was, will be found in the ruins of some poor person's house many years down the line.
That's definitely true. And, it might be that we find, some petrified library that will tell us all this information that was very deliberately destroyed by the Spanish in the Aztec case and many other parts of modern day Mexico. So yes, there's a world where we find some very insightful and magnificent things. But as we were walking through this extraordinary place, which was partially also extraordinary because it's empty and it's just a city. This is where tens of thousands of people once lived. And there were, 12 of us all over the site. And we were walking around. You could see all these little corners, and it's all very, very impressive. And Jose Martin, who we met at the bottom of the ruins, told us that there was, there's only 2% uncovered. And he had taken us to a part that was, technically not allowed. We were not technically allowed to go to show us how everything looked before they started digging. He said, look, this is the line, and everything that you see to the right would have looked like everything that you see to the left. And on the left, it was all shrubs. There was no way of actually, discerning that there were ruins underneath. And with that in mind, when we were walking at the very, very top of the hill, because sort of the city's built sort of on elevation, and it keeps rising and rising and rising. We got to the very top of the hill. We went to the highest pyramid. And then we went to the top of the highest pyramid, and we looked around, and it was incredible because looking around, we could see that 98% that is missing. It was once you know what it looked like before and what's underneath, you could see dozens upon dozens of what are clearly pyramids that we have yet to uncover.
But that shouldn't stop you, dear listener, from visiting what has already been discovered in these hidden gems of Mexican archaeology. Give Chichen Itzá a break, or after you've visited, have a look at these and the many other wonderful sites that Mexico has on offer.
I'm Tavo Figueroa.
And I'm Alex Gonzalez-Hormerod.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we're excavating the ruins of Mexican history and politics and bring them to you on a tight budget.
Which is why you should subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist.
Till next time.
Bye for now.